welcome to the programme. Well, the violence in South Sudan began after claims by the president of an attempted coup. The result has been at least 500 people dead and 34,000 people living in UN compounds like this, one of which has been attacked. Well, President Obama says the world's newest country stands at a precipice, while President Kiir says the violence is a dispute over power and politics. For others, this falls down ethnic lines. We're going to be joined by guests in Nairobi and in London, and hopefully soon in Australia too. Plus, as Europe's Gaia satellite launches into space, hoping to discover 50,000 planets and map more than 1 billion stars, we'll discuss what's behind the recent space revival. There are plenty of ways for you to get in touch on phone, Twitter and also on Facebook.
I experienced.
This is chaos.
People are going to want to know.
Let's just say something.
Well, welcome to the programme. If you want to get in touch with us over the next hour or so, send your messages in to us. They'll come to me here on my tablet and we'll try and include as many of them as we possibly can. Let me introduce you to Hannah Graham, who joins us from London. Until very recently was in South Sudan, based there working in education. And Hannah, I spoke to you earlier this week on the BBC World Service when you were in South Sudan. Since then, did you feel it was necessary yourself to get out?
Yes, absolutely. I got back here yesterday morning after leaving on a commercial flight the day before. The situation just became too dangerous, and my partner and I did not feel safe to stay in country.
Explain what you saw, what you heard in the days since the beginning of the week when I spoke to you, and you said that at that stage there were gunshots in the background. You felt safe at the time. What's happened in the days since then?
To be honest with you, the fighting sort of intensified and it moved to the centre of town. I myself was based in the centre of Juba in a compound near the presidential compound, and the fighting moved to the centre of the town, and I think that was the case when we spoke. It just became too dangerous. I didn't actually see a great deal per se of the fighting, but we were surrounded by gunfire. There was heavy artillery fire. There were tanks moving just in the next street. It was just far too insecure for us to remain. We also saw a great deal of movement. People of East African descent and South Sudanese who were moving at any given opportunity from where they had been staying to try to find somewhere safe. That really indicated that it was getting worse, and actually on the outskirts of town, the fighting was very serious indeed.
Well, Hannah, do stay with us. I want to pull up this video, which is of South Sudan's President Salva Kiir. He spoke on national TV on Monday, just after the violence began.
Dear citizens, rest assured that the government is doing all it can to make sure that citizens are secured and safe. Long live SPLM, SPLA. Long live the unity of our people. Long live the Republic of South Sudan.
And that's the President Salva Kiir of South Sudan. As you can appreciate, I'm sure, getting through to people on Skype lines in South Sudan is proving a little bit challenging at the moment. Do bear with us and we'll try and contact some people that we're hoping to get on the programme. But let's head over to Nairobi now and let's introduce you to Moses Rono, who is the BBC Africa security correspondent. And Moses, picking up on that address from the President in South Sudan, what's the general take on how this is being dealt with? Of course, we were told at the beginning of the week this violence started because of an attempted coup.
Right, yeah, the government version is this was an attempted coup, and now what we are seeing is a fallout from an attempted coup which was orchestrated by the sacked Vice President Riek Machar, was dismissed in July. That's the version of the government. Riek Machar has also spoken saying there was nothing like so, there was no coup, and even then he wasn't involved in anything. He's then called on the president to step down. The president has been repeating that his offer for dialogue. This afternoon, the vice president repeated the same message, but still nobody has moved ground, and we don't know where we are as far as attempts to close the gap or try to reach an agreement on this, how that is going.
And obviously the concern is that the violence is very much falling down ethnic lines. Although the president says this is about power and politics, the real concern is an all-out civil war falling down ethnic lines.
Right, that has been the concern actually from a lot of international actors and a lot of people as well who've been speaking to. They are saying, although this started out as a political issue between the president and his deputy, or rather his sacked deputy and other military units, now this conflict has taken on an ethnic dimension. This was illustrated yesterday. There was an attack in Akobo in Jonglei State, up north of the country, in which suspected Nuer gangs attacked a camp of the UN mission there, which was sheltering Dinka members in that region. Obviously, the issue is because the two actors in this situation, the sacked vice president, Riek Machar, is from the smaller Nuer group. The president is a Dinka from the major ethnic group. So it has been very clear that this sort of is playing out along the ethnic lines according to a lot of versions, and that has been a concern. The authorities are keen to say there's nothing of the sort, but still the situation remains tense. A lot of people are concerned. Thousands have still continued to flee the country by road, and also in a number of few planes leaving the capital, Juba.
Hannah, before you left South Sudan, speaking to colleagues, friends who were in the country, which version of events did they sign up to? Which did they agree with? And how concerned were they about this idea of an ethnic war?
To be honest with you, most of my colleagues and friends very strongly felt that this conflict was about power and about politics. Unfortunately, however, the way that these things have a history of going in South Sudan is that they very much become about ethnicity. That tends to be because leading key figures align themselves with large groups within the population, and that tends to happen along ethnic lines. As a result, my personal feeling is that existing ethnic tensions are being manipulated and used in order to achieve political objectives. And aside from that, my colleagues and friends have been reporting that even this morning to me by phone. People are very concerned for their well-being based on their ethnicity, but still feel that's not the instigating factor to the current crisis.
Well, Hannah and Moses, I want to introduce you to Mading Noor, who's in Juba, a freelance journalist in South Sudan. Pleased to say that we have managed to get lines through to South Sudan eventually. Mading, thank you for joining us on World Have Your Say. I don't know how much you heard of what Hannah said there, but she said, speaking to friends in South Sudan before she left, there's a real concern that they could be targeted because of their ethnicity. Is that the sort of thing that you're hearing on the ground as well?
I think so. There is fear of the unknown. You don't know who is your enemy. You don't know who is going to target you next. But the government has been trying to assert its control, and it has been preaching a message of unity. That, remember, it was only 2 years ago we voted for our unity. So we have to always make sure there is something, an entity called South Sudan. While there are ethnic tensions that are ongoing, and there have been some clashes here and there, some Nuers have been killed here and there, and some Dinka have been killed here and there, the government is saying, let's come to the center, let's come to South Sudan, and let's move away from the tribes. So it is undeniable that in recent days, the fighting has taken, in some isolated cases, taken into an ethnic angle.
And for people watching around the world who aren't familiar with the ethnic makeup of South Sudan and those tensions that you talk about, explain, it's the world's newest country, it's only been in existence for 2 years. How is it that it could so quickly be falling apart?
It is important to know that South Sudan is larger than the Dinka and the Nuer. There are about 66 tribes, and they have been coexisting peacefully. For many years, they were fighting, resisting against common enemy. And that was Sudan, and that was Khartoum. If South Sudanese, 66 tribes, didn't have anything in common, they would have not voted 99% to claim their destiny. They got their own government 2 years ago. The government that exists in Juba is broad-based, is very representative of other tribes. So it is not true to say that the state is a Dinka or Nuer state. Whatever the Dinka or the Nuer say will determine the fate of the nation. But it is also true that this is a country in transition. And this is normal for South Sudan, because it is a new nation. And the reason why it fought for many years is so that it takes its own destiny into its own hand. But the responsibility of statehood is overwhelming. There is no infrastructure in place. We are dependent on oil as our only source of revenues, and that has often been interrupted. Basic services have not gone out to the populations of South Sudan. There are real issues to talk about here. And the government is a weak government because it has been in place for only 2 years. So it is unable to manage the situation for a long time. But I think with the statehood, we are turning a corner. Despite all these challenges, I think we are only growing up.
Mading, let's put that point back to Moses. Do you see this, as Mading does, as part of the transition, almost the growing stage that South Sudan has to go through?
That's the same question I put to a South Sudanese I spoke to this morning. I was asking, maybe this is a kind of process that this country has to go. And he told me that, look, this country has had almost half a century of violence between 1955, 1956, up to more recently, with just a little break. And in during this period, thousands of people have been killed, actually at least 1.5 million people. And he told me that a lot of people have shed their blood for this country. And what we are seeing today will just make a mockery of those who died fighting for the freedom that this country today has, the South Sudanese today have. But I guess the bigger issue is really how this process moves forward, because there have been a lot of rivalry and sort of divisions within the country, within the government. There are people who think that maybe it's the start of a process towards laying a foundation for a nation. But I thought that it's a bit too early to see a lot of such divisions bubbling out. Elections, the first major elections will be 2015, and it's just too early in the day to see this violence. And I think the bigger issue, though, is how they manage the politicians. If indeed these are process towards a sort of a statehood, you know, what matters, though, at this point is how they will manage this situation from killing more people to add on to the millions who died from the years of war.
Moses Rono, the BBC Africa security correspondent, joining us from Nairobi. I thank you because I know that you have to leave us now. I want to pull up one of the messages from politicians on South Sudan TV. Moses talking there about the role of politicians. And this simply came up on South Sudan TV, Stop the Ethnic Divide. And Hannah, I saw that you nodded during Moses' answer. Do you think that this is one of the things that the ethnicity issue is something that the politicians really have to get a grip of?
Yes, very much so. I think the idea that this is an inevitable conflict is very flawed. South Sudanese are able to coexist and have been doing so in relative peace for the last few years. As we know, there are certain hotspots, certain troubled areas, but there are parts of the country that live incredibly peacefully and have been doing so since 2005, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. I think what we do have to be sort of very clear about is that this is not inevitable, that this is not simply a tribal thing, like I think a lot of people would be inclined to believe. This is something that is being actively carried out. I spoke with with a friend a couple of times over the last couple of days. He was a former child soldier in the SPLA and has since rejoined after a number of years being out of the army. And he told me by phone, word for word, that he has decided to defend his nation against the Nuer. He's Equatorian, he does not belong to either the Dinka or the Nuer tribe. And what's incredibly troubling for me is that these existing ethnic tensions are being used to almost like have greater control over certain groups.
Well, Hannah, we'll pick that up again. We're going to take a quick break. So many of your questions coming in, which we will put to our guests in the next few minutes. Do stay with us on World Have Your Say.
No,
I absolutely
talking about it. Jade, let me say something. No,
I absolutely
talking about it. Jade, let me say something.
Welcome back to World Have Your Say. We're discussing the situation in South Sudan. If you want to get in touch with us, we're on Twitter. You can use the hashtag WHYS or head to Facebook. Let me introduce you to a guest we're joined by now from the UN mission in South Sudan. Dirk Segar is in Juba. Thank you for joining us on the programme, sir. I wonder, first of all, when we hear the comments from President Obama that he says South Sudan stands at a precipice, do you agree that the situation is that serious?
I must say it is definitely very serious. The situation is very fluid. It is very tense. You see a lot of displacement of people are clearly living in fear. We have received in just a spate of a few days, we've received 36,000 civilians in our various UN bases across the country. If people come running towards your base, you know it is serious. Of course, it's very hard to predict in a situation as fluid as it is. It is clearly a political conflict at the leadership level, but it has ripple effects throughout the country. You have communities that support certain groups. You have people, you have a country that it is awash with weapons. They have, only just emerged of so many years of civil war. It is very, very difficult to predict how these political struggles at the highest level that the SPLM has been able to resolve in many times in the past. It's very hard to see, as soon if the tensions rise at the local level. It's very, very hard to predict how they play out. It's just clear that at this time it's very hard to predict that there are way too many people with guns in their hands, that there are all kind of thuggish groups that take things in their own hands. So the situation is just very hard to control.
And so what is it that the UN would like to see happen now? Is it a case of people intervening, countries around? What do you see as the most effective way forward to prevent all-out civil war, which is obviously the concern?
Well, two things need to happen simultaneously, right? One is to protect civilians that are under imminent threat as much as possible, and that's why why the UN is here. That's why we got this mandate to protect civilians in South Sudan. So we are doing whatever we can with the limited resources that we have stretched across the country as much as possible. But in terms of what others can do and what also we are doing at every level, at the highest political level, to the community level, church leaders, any kind of group with certain influence, we're asking for calm. We're asking for people with decision-making power, with people with control over certain parts of South Sudan, certain communities, to make sure that they try to calm things down, that they come to the table to try to resolve this issue politically, as they have been able to do so many times in the past, rather than let this country descend into violence, which we want to avoid at any cost. So any kind of political influence on some people who have power to change things here, whether it's at the community level or at the highest political level, that is what needs to happen right now. And we do that every single moment at this point.
Dirk Segar, who is from the UN mission in South Sudan, thank you for joining us on the line from Juba. I want to bring in Tongan Lo Leung, who is in Frankfurt, South Sudanese living in Germany. Tongan, what do you make of the leadership of your politicians? We heard there the UN saying that it really is down to the politicians to make very careful decisions going forward. What have you made of their actions so far?
Well, to begin with, first let me take this opportunity, airtime opportunity, to express my sincere condolences to all those who have lost their lives. You know, in the African culture, as this Kenyan philosopher John Mbithe has aptly described in his African traditional religions and philosophies, we are all related to each other laterally, you know, or horizontally, so to speak. So everybody is relative to everybody. So I really feel aggrieved by what's going on in our country. And this brings me to the point that I want to say about our leadership. I believe our leadership has conducted themselves in a very, very irresponsible way. And sometimes it has really made me wonder, how can they behave like this when we have, in our culture, the elders are supposed to be the ones that are guiding us by examples. You know, but the way they've conducted themselves is just reckless and irresponsible. So I appeal for them to come back to their senses. I appeal for Salva Kiir to come back to his senses and detach himself. Detach himself from the group of people that he surrounded himself. As the saying goes, bad company corrupts good character. Salva Kiir, is a very good man. Personally, I think he's a good person, you know, but politically he has just been misled by the people he has been surrounding himself with. You know, he's completely detached from reality on the ground. This is the first thing, and the second thing is, I also appeal to Dr. Riek Machar to speak out and to issue a statement calling for the Nuer people to calm down. This should be resolved politically, because it is, as Mr. Doug Segar said, is a political issue at the leadership level that should be addressed.
Well, Tongan, I hope you forgive me for interrupting, because I want to pull up this cartoon, which has been drawn of President Salva Kiir and is being shared a lot online. And it was actually drawn by Khalid Albi, who has sent us this video to explain why he drew it.
My cartoon depicting Salva Kiir is basically Salva Kiir with his beard as the map of South Sudan. I actually did this cartoon before the attempted coup, as when he dismissed his old cabinet, because I felt, even though the separation happened and peace is supposed to be the norm now, there's still a lot of problems in the north and in the south and between the two. So I thought, in the south, they're going through the same problems that we're going through in the north, which is a military president that doesn't want to give up the power or doesn't want to listen to anybody but himself. And he's claiming that the country is him, just like al-Bashir is doing in the north, Salva Kiir is doing on the south.
That video in from South Sudan from the gentleman who drew that cartoon. I want to put that point to Mading Noor, who is freelance journalist in South Sudan, still with us. Do you agree with that? There are similar problems between the north and the south?
That is true, because we shared one country for 50 years, but we are breaking away and we have some symptoms. We have inherited some bad practices that used to be in Sudan, whether it's corruption or in various inefficiencies. But I think we have to remember how this government came about. This is not a normal government. And the power
and Mading, I am so sorry to interrupt you, and I probably didn't give you enough time to answer that, so I do apologise, but we have to take a quick break and then we'll carry on talking when we're talking about... Hello, I'm Chloe Tilley. Well, for the next 20 minutes, we're talking space. One of the most ambitious missions ever has been launched by Europe. The Gaia satellite is taken 20 years to develop and could discover 50,000 planets and map more than 1 billion stars. But India and China have also launched recent missions, so we're going to look at what's driving this renewed desire to explore space.
Barriers.
Talking about it. let me say something.
Well, welcome back to World Have Your Say. So many people getting in touch with us from all around the world. We've got calls coming in from Ghana, Nigeria, India, Australia, South Sudan, Eritrea, Kenya, Chad and Sudan. If you want to carry on our discussion about South Sudan, head to facebook.com/World Have Your Say. But we're going to talk space now, and I want to introduce you to two guests who are here to join that conversation. Emily Rice is Professor of Astrophysics at the College of Staten Island in New York City, and Sarah Horst is Astronomy and Astrophysics Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Colorado Boulder in the US. Welcome both of you to World Have Your Say. And first of all, this is so confusing and incredibly mind-blowing what this Gaia mission is all about. I wonder, Emily, first of all, in layman's terms, if you can explain what it's hoping to find and why that is important.
Gaia is actually almost a fantastically simple mission, actually. All it's really doing is measuring the positions of stars. Their positions in space, their motions over 5 years, and with that we'll be able to figure out how they're moving through space, how 1 billion stars are moving through the galaxy. We'll be able to measure their brightnesses, we'll be able to figure out their compositions, how bright they are, whether or not they have planets around them. It's going to tell us a lot about the formation of the galaxy, the formation of stars. It's going to really open up a huge amount of information for astronomers all over the world.
And Sarah, how excited are you by this? Do you think it will fill in a lot of gaps?
Oh, of course. I mean, we're still kind of in the infancy of the space age, and to have this information is just going to be so hugely important for pretty much every aspect of astronomy.
And is this more about looking back to how we got to where we are now, or about looking forward to see what else is out there and where we could end up?
It's both. It'll provide us information, for both aspects. It's what we work on as astronomers is understanding how we got here, understanding how the universe is going to evolve going forward, and understanding what else is out there in the universe.
Emily, you're nodding.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the fantastic thing about astronomy, is that because of the fact that some of these stars live for billions and billions of years, we can find the oldest stars and figure out kind of how the galaxy formed and how it's changed over time. And then we can also use this to answer questions about ourselves, really, because Gaia is going to find thousands of planets probably, and so we can start to look for Earth-like planets around sun-like stars, or continue really looking for Earth-like planets around sun-like stars, figure out really, get closer to answering some of these really fundamental questions about the, planet formation and the possibilities of life in the universe.
Well, if you're talking about life, it's something that always fascinates sort of non-space types like myself. And I guess it's the first question. We've had lots of questions coming in from people saying, does this mean we will find life on other planets? Not necessarily little green men, but whether it's organisms. Is that going to get us any closer to it, realistically?
Absolutely, yeah. The thing about finding life is it's a lot up to chance, really, because the universe has been around for 14 billion years nearly, and if you think about it, we've been kind of a technologically advanced civilization for only about 100 years, which is just, in terms of time, a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket. And in terms of space, we're in the same situation, where we can only look for planets around other stars relatively close to us. Gaia is going to expand that by a huge amount, because we'll be able to look for planets around many more nearby stars, for example, than the Kepler mission has allowed us to do, but it's still, in order to definitively answer these questions, we're just going to have to get really, really lucky. But working up to that, we can start to answer questions about planet formation and what types of planets are common, how they form, how long they might last around stars, what they might be like in the habitable zone and things like that. And so there's lots of kind of smaller steps along the way that we're definitely making progress on.
It's interesting, Emily, that you talk about being lucky. And I wonder, Sarah, how much of this is about luck and just almost falling across things that take you on a different path?
Well, a lot of science is about luck, but part of that is putting yourself in the position to be lucky. And I think that's, one of the most important aspects of what we do in space exploration is, giving ourselves the opportunity to make amazing discoveries. If we don't launch these spacecraft, if we don't take these observations, then it doesn't matter if we're lucky or not. We're never going to find these things. And so that's one of the reasons why we have to do these things. There is obviously an element of luck, but there's also an element of intention and of, putting ourselves in the position to be lucky in the first place.
Well, we're live here for the next 15 minutes. If you've got a question for Sarah or Emily, use the hashtag WHYS on Twitter, or head to facebook.com/World Have Your Say. We'll put as many questions as we can to our experts. I want to introduce Paul now. Paul Hill, who is in Wiltshire in the UK, an amateur astronomer who does the Awesome Astronomy podcast. Paul, welcome to World Have Your Say. Maybe you could answer this question first of all. Ob has posted on Facebook, apart from science, who profits from these high-cost projects? Just explain in real terms.
Right. I mean, I think there's two parts of that question. First of all, the high cost. I mean, the cost of the Gaia probe yesterday, really, in the big scheme of government budgets, isn't actually that great. I mean, I think the UK spent £1 billion on a destroyer last year. So, you know, the kind of cost in euros, I think 750,000 euros. It's a bargain to discover things that we're going to find out through this probe. Is incredible. Our understanding of the universe is going to be improved by this single probe. The things we will see, the things we will find out from 750,000 euros is a bargain.
A bargain. Would you agree with that, Emily?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's fantastic about science, and I think that's changed a lot recently, is that science really does benefit everybody, partially because we're trying really hard to make it accessible, to make sure that anybody that wants to, for example, become a scientist can become a scientist. Anybody that wants to contribute to it, even through citizen science programs, you know, websites like the Zooniverse, like Planet Hunters, you can really, the data is publicly available. A lot of scientists try to act as kind of ambassadors to the public, make sure people can understand the discoveries, understand the methods, understand what's going on and why we're spending this money, how we're spending this money, and also contribute if you want to. And it really is a bargain compared to military spending, compared to, you know, financial business spending and things like that. And the money doesn't go into space. The money goes to universities, it goes to scientists, it goes to technology development. It really is a bargain.
But Sarah, I can hear people all around the world yelling at their television screen as they watch this, saying, a bargain, what are you talking about? 740 million euros. You know, when you look at Europe and a lot of the world, in recession, times are tight, people don't have a lot of money, living standards, poverty. This is a crazy amount of money to spend on vanity, quite frankly.
Well, first of all, I don't think it's vanity. I mean, we're trying to push the edges of our knowledge about ourselves and the universe, and that's going to benefit us in the long term, no matter what. But as Emily had said, you know, this money doesn't get launched into space. I mean, we did launch a spacecraft into space, but the money itself is spent here on Earth. It goes back into the economies of all of those countries that you have mentioned. Here in the U.S., industry to do with space is one of the main economic drivers in a large number of states in the U.S., including Colorado, where I'm at. So, you know, that money is still going back into the economy, and we're also getting, you know, the investment in science and technology and in our future out of it. So it is a lot of money, but it's also, you know, it's aspirational. It's to do things that are the best of what we can do as humans, and that helps us kind of look to the future and be positive about the future, even when things aren't always perfect here on Earth.
Paul, I can see you nodding.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's difficult in times when you look at what's going on in the world, the conflicts, the famines in times. It's difficult sometimes to say, well, you know, we're going to launch a probe, we're going to map 1 billion stars, but there has to be more. We can't just keep paying for the little problem. Not little problems, they're huge problems, but we can't just look at all the problems. We've got to look at the best of humanity, and we've got to look at exploring and going forward and improving our knowledge and improving humanity's lot. And it's not just mapping stars and things like that. The technology and the engineering that goes into these probes filters down in the same way that Formula One cars, you know, filters down into normal family cars. The same technology from these space probes filters down into our everyday lives.
Okay, well, Emily, Sarah and Paul all do stay with us. Plenty more to talk about on this topic. If you want to get your questions in, you've got about 10 minutes left. Facebook and Twitter are the places to go. Stay with us.
No, I talking about it. Jade, let me say something. No, I talking about it. Jade, let me say something.
Welcome back. So many of you getting in touch with us, getting calls from Pakistan, the UAE, Ghana, Nigeria, India. Do please keep those calls and comments coming into us. Still with us are Emily Rice, Professor of Astrophysics at the College of Staten Island in New York City, Sarah Hurst, Astronomy and Astrophysics Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Colorado Boulder, and Paul Hill, who's in the UK, an amateur astronomer who does the Awesome Astronomy podcast. And I wonder, as we talk, so many things have happened recently, so many space missions. When you look at India, when you look at China, reading today, this Japanese robot who's been having a chat with an astronaut from the International Space Station. It seems like there's almost a revival in space, a greater interest, and more countries prepared to put money into it. Would you agree that that's the case? And I encourage you all to talk to each other about this. Paul, do you want to start?
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of it is driven at the moment by Asia and the Asian economies and the sort of aspirations of places like India and China. Certainly a space program is something that flags you up as a nation that is going somewhere. We've got high technology, and so you look back at the 60s and the space race between the Americans and the Russians, and that was a big spur into space exploration, and the moon landings were sort of the ultimate goal of that. But now I think we're looking at India and China and Japan and even places like Korea that are now starting to launch these really interesting probes and doing some very, very interesting science.
It's really fun. On one hand, I like the term space race. I'm excited about the fact that kind of there's an international motivation now, somewhat possibly political motivation, but I really hope that we can continue to do things internationally. I love the idea of the International Space Station, knowing there's so many astronauts that are in orbit around the Earth from so many different countries. I like to think of it as like a fun run more than a race, where everybody is going to be a winner. Anybody that participates is going to win. It's really going to encourage a lot more people to participate and really benefit, you know, people in the race and spectators alike.
Well, and one of the things to understand, you know, is that science is by its nature international. I mean, we work together, you know, with scientists across the world all the time, and so I think for me, I'm just excited that more countries are coming to the table, and there's just going to be more science that comes out of it first and foremost as China and India start, you know, launching their own missions, and that's going to benefit all of us as we work, you know, as we work together as scientists and hopefully eventually as actual partners in missions. There's a mission in orbit around Saturn right now called Cassini-Huygens. It's been there for almost 10 years, and that mission is a joint mission between the United States and the European Space Agency, and that's just been a huge benefit, I think, to collaboration between the United States and all continue forward in that way, working with other countries as they start their own space programs. It's really just going to be a benefit, not just for science, but all of humankind.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting that the Chang'e 3 probe that landed on the moon from China, actually, it got there partly due to the efforts of the European Space Agency and their deep sky communication network that actually communicated with the probe as it landed. So there is this international flavor even in these new national space missions.
It's really fantastic, and even telescopes on the ground. It just came to my mind the 30-meter telescope, which is a new one. It's going to be the largest ground-based telescope in the world. It's under construction in Hawaii on the island of Mauna Kea. Is now even more international than any of the existing telescopes on the ground. So many countries have bought into it. The U.S., I believe, Canada, India, Chile. So many countries that have contributed to ground-based astronomy as well. You know, it's not just the International Space Station and these space exploration programs, but the way that we study astrophysics on the ground is very, very international.
And yeah, I mean, this continues, I think, a very long history in astronomy of international collaboration. That it was one of the real first international endeavors where you go back to the sort of 16th and 17th, 18th centuries, where nations, even nations that were nominally at war, were cooperating over things like observing the transits of Venus. So it's always had a very international flavor.
Well, and it's almost, you know, the laws of physics that force that, right? I mean, you have to be certain places on the Earth to be able to see certain parts of the sky. And so we've always had to figure out a way to work together so that we can observe as much of the sky as possible from Earth.
And nobody owns the sky. It's there for all of us.
We've had this tweet which has just come in from Active Astronomy in London saying, Do each of you think that the knowledge we get from space is actually more important than the technology?
That's a
Yes,
hard question
yes.
to ask scientists. I think I would say that they're both important in their own ways. I mean, I think the fundamental understanding that we're gaining about the universe around us is very important, but there are very real, tangible improvements to life on Earth that have come from these things as well. I mean, you think about, GPS and a lot of cell phone technology, all of those things exist because as individual countries and eventually as partners, we decided to go into space. And if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have those technologies. So I think they're both very important, just in their own ways.
Yeah, I mean, I would say knowledge probably wins it, because knowledge is forever. Technology constantly changes and evolves, and they go hand in hand. But the knowledge we gain from some of these technologies will continue forever. But the technology will change, we will replace things, but what we find out about stars and what we find out about the universe is always going to be there.
I'm gonna side with Paul on this one. It's just, for me now, to look up to the stars, even just a few that I can see from New York City at night, but to know that there's planets around some of them. That's something that we've only known for certain for just barely a decade now, but to know that there are planets out there, billions of planets around the billions of stars in the Milky Way galaxy, that they're forming, that so far we know that they're different from the solar system planets, but we might one day find similar planets to the planets in the solar system, or kind of know how unique we are in the galaxy, is just, it's a feeling I can't describe. It's a feeling more than a knowledge. I think that's a fantastic thing, and it's something that I hope everybody can know and everybody can understand, because it changes the way that you think about the world and about other people and about society and history and pretty much everything. It's just I feel very, very lucky. Again, lucky, but we can do this now. It's amazing. It's absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's a golden age of exploration. It really is.
Well, we're lucky to live in a time where we're advanced enough that we're capable of asking questions about the universe around us, but also capable of answering them, and
We've literally got about 1 minute left on the programme, but I wonder if you see a limit to human exploration in space, or whether there are no bounds.
No
Absolutely
boundaries.
not. I'm sure we can agree on this one, yeah. There's no limit. We've only scratched the surface.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily us going ourselves. That's more difficult, but we can send probes, we can look with telescopes, the boundaries are limitless.
Yeah, absolutely.
But presumably there's still got to be the money and the appetite by countries politically as much as anything to carry on pursuing the space project.
That's really the bottleneck right now.
And I think recent events have shown that is still there, that the public appetite. You look at things like Twitter and Facebook when these missions are launched, and there's a real buzz and there's lots of people following, and they're very excited about it.
We just have to get the politicians on board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that does change. I mean, do you see differences between administrations and a desire between governments to get involved?
Well, it's very difficult in the U.S. because, these space missions are very long term, and we have a new president, at least every 4 years. And so, trying to get things to survive from administration to administration can be very difficult here in the U.S. ESA funds its programs a little bit differently, so they don't run into some of the problems that we run into, but it still can be quite difficult to keep the eye on, the long-term plan when you have politicians involved.
Well, Emily, Sarah and Paul, thank you all so much for joining us on World Have Your Say. And that's all for this edition of the programme. If you switch over to the BBC World Service in just over 2 hours' time, we will be discussing how the fight against Islamic extremism can be taken on by different parts of the world. You can carry on talking about this at facebook.com/World Have Your Say.